Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online event from the Telegraph Live. My name is Amber Dalton. I am the content editor for Telegraph Wine Cellar, and I will be your host for the next hour. If you're not already familiar with Telegraph Wine Cellar, it's a new wine club from the Telegraph. We've worked with our regular columnists, so Victoria Moore, Susie Atkins, and Hamish Anderson, and our wine partner, Enotria & Co., to carefully select a range of around 170 handpicked wines. These are hard to find bottles that you won't typically find on supermarket shelves or in other wine clubs. As a member of the Wine Cellar, you'll enjoy exclusive prices on our wines, additional discounts on cases, plus articles and recommendations from Telegraph writers. So over the next hour, I'll be joined by two of our wine experts, Victoria Moore and Hamish Anderson. They'll be sharing their advice ahead of Christmas and giving you their insider tips on which wines to pick for your festive table. And don't worry, we will be posting links to any of the wines that they mention in the notes, and these will be sent to you after the event, so you don't need to write them down. You can just sit back and enjoy the evening. We've already received some questions via email, but we also want to hear from you at home. So please submit your questions for Victoria and Hamish. You can just scroll down to the Q&A box below, and we will try to tackle as many of those as we can. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests this evening, Victoria Moore and Hamish Anderson. Telegraph readers will already be familiar with Victoria. She's an award-winning journalist who writes the drinks column in the Telegraph magazine on Saturday, and she contributes regularly to the newspaper and website. She's also the author of the best-selling book, The Wine Dine Dictionary, which is an absolute Bible for food and wine matching. And her impressive list of awards includes the Louis Roederer Wine Columnist of the Year, Online Communicator of the Year, and the Fortnum and Mason Drinks Writer of the Year. Hamish is the CEO of Tate Eats and a regular contributor to the Telegraph magazine and telegraph.co.uk. He started his career in wine at Bibendum Restaurant and has run the Tate's renowned cellars for 25 years. During that time, Hamish and his team have won numerous awards for Best Wine List. He is a leading commentator on wine, a regular judge at competitions, and he is the author of Vino, Great Wine for Everyday Life. So let's start talking about wine. And the first question we'd like to tackle is one from Antonia. And she asks, what's the best value champagne for Christmas morning? Over to you, Hamish.
Thank you very much, Amber, and good evening and welcome. A pleasure to be here to be talking about wine early in December. Firstly, I apologise, my colleagues have got much better Christmas trees behind them than I have. But what I have in my glass here will hopefully get us into the festive mood. I think the question from Antonio was, what was the best value champagne? I'm going to actually willfully ignore the first bit of the question, which was which is the champagne bit, and concentrate on the value element, because I know Victoria's got a champagne for us later on. So what I wanted to share with you and show you this evening was a wine from Carver. And Carver is a region that for many of us has some preconceptions. There's some quite large producers there. So it's not often seen as a region that produces really high quality sparkling wine. But the 2017 Gramona that I've got in my glass here this evening is, I think, a really, really great example of a sparkling wine that costs roughly the same as a kind of sort of lower price champagne. But in my view, really, in terms of the quality and the value, what you get in the glass absolutely over delivers. Because what you have here is really one of the best producers in Carver. So you're tapping into really one of the best producers in the region at a price point that you wouldn't even get close to getting one of the best producers in Champagne. So this is made the same way as Champagne. It's what we call the sort of traditional method. So the second fermentation happens in the bottle. Quite a long aging process as well. So when you taste it, you get these lovely kind of sort of slightly toasty, creamy flavors, which you get with these bottle aged sparkling wines. It's not a champagne, and it's not trying to be like a champagne. You get this lovely kind of sort of savory citrus character as well, which I think comes through from the local grapes they're using here, Chirello mostly. But it's got this most sort of kind of gorgeous texture and weight to it. Which is another kind of sort of, I think, as a sort of a slight insider tip on champagne and indeed sparkling wines as a whole, is that kind of sort of texture and weight, and particularly in a festive kind of context, it is brilliant because it goes with, you can drink it as an aperitif. You got some smoked salmon, you got some little aperitifs, some nibbles. It just carries it brilliantly through a whole kind of different ranges of food. So I cannot recommend this heartily enough. And we tasted all this in the lineup, and just it's tasting absolutely brilliant. Now I haven't tried it for a few months, but just such a lovely glass to get home to from work and taste this. But Victoria, I know you've been at a lot of tastings lately and tasted many of the sort of supermarket champagnes and some of the broader champagnes as well. What has been your kind of pick of those?
It's always a bit of a mission every year to find which supermarket or high street retailer is doing the best champagne. But I agree with you, Hamish. I very often at home go for a sort of first class sparkling wine rather than a super cheap champagne. But I feel sorry for Cava all the time because it has this reputation of cheapness, doesn't it? And it can be quite hard to get people over that bump. And this bottle of Gramona is something completely different. With these supermarket champagnes, there are two supermarkets that year in, year out produce amazing own label champagnes, and you're not going to be surprised because I know you've tasted these before, but the Co-op own label is fantastic. It's called Les Pionnières, and the Tesco Finest is also just a beautiful champagne. They're both quite different styles, actually. The Les Pionnières is a bit more appley. It's a little bit kind of more savoury and spicy. And the Finest is quite high in Chardonnay. So it's just really welcoming and easy to drink and quite creamy. And they're both really good. And a lot of people say to me, but it says the name of the supermarket on the label. What are my friends going to say? And I'm saying, your friends are not going to be looking at the label. They're going to be drinking what's in their glass and talking to their friends. But something quite interesting has happened on the champagne shelves this year, which is that there's been a champagne shortage. This has been caused by two things. First of all, a short harvest in 2020, which was a deliberate thing. So when COVID came along, I'm sure everyone remembers what happened in 2020. COVID came along, no one felt like celebrating. So we all stopped drinking champagne temporarily. Meanwhile, the Champenois said, we need to make sure the balance between supply and demand doesn't go wrong. So we're going to just cut the yields that the growers are allowed to harvest this year. So they made a deliberately short harvest in 2020. Almost as soon as the harvest came in, champagne sales went whoosh, straight back up again. 2021 was a naturally small harvest, and suddenly there was a champagne shortage. And anybody who's been shopping for champagne this year has probably noticed the effects of that. And they've been quite good in a way, because what we've seen lots of new champagne brands come onto the shelves. People had to look elsewhere. I know Charles Lee at Lee and Sanderman, the wine merchants, was furious because he couldn't get enough of the champagnes that he normally buys. He jumped in his car, he went over to France, and he came back with a dozen new grower producers to add to his list. You might be sitting at home thinking, what is a grower producer? It is quite simply somebody who grows the grapes and makes the champagne themselves from the grapes that they have grown, rather than buying someone else's grapes. And they are typically family-run businesses. They don't have the might or the marketing might of the big champagne houses. And there are lots of really good ones out there. And in fact, that is why we have the champagne that I want to show you in the Telegraph Wine Cellar. It's a grower champagne that comes from a family producer that wasn't being imported into the UK. And I happened to be at the London Wine Fair in May, and I met one of the directors from Inoctria, and he said, Victoria, I want you to go and taste this champagne. Let me know if it's any good. We think it's good and we're thinking about buying it. Let me know if you'd like it for the wine club. Well, I did like it. So we have it. And it comes in, I think it's amazingly good value. It comes in under £30, but there's something quite unusual about it. So you probably already know there are three main champagne grapes. This one is very unusually made with a majority, 60%, of one called Pinot Meunier. Now, when Monsieur, was tasting this with me, he said, I'm not going to tell you what the assemblage, what the grape mixture is until you've tasted it. Pinot Meunier typically tastes quite spicy And it can, if there's too much of it, it can make champagnes that are quite baggy. This is not baggy. It's super crisp. So you get this kind of intense spiciness and then a really crisp, clean finish on it. It's a lovely champagne. And I also really enjoy these styles made with the black grapes. There's 20% Chardonnay, but it's mostly black grapes. In winter, there's just something wonderful about it. So, Hamish, I wanted to ask you, I have my champagne, can anyone see this? In this glass. What do you like to drink champagne out of at home and in the restaurant?
Well, you can see both our glasses. I mean, yours is maybe a slightly more traditional champagne glasses, but both of our glasses that we're holding up are kind of leaning a little bit more towards a wine glass. I mean, mine is a wine glass. I think it's an interesting question because it's a sort of fun and interesting thing to think about how sort of fashion and things change over our times in the wine trade. I mean, certainly when I first started as a sommelier, it would have been very hard in a smart restaurant to serve champagne in anything other than a champagne flute. And it's one of those things that no one really ever challenged. And actually, slowly over time, people have started to work out, and particularly like the style. And I know the champagne that you've showed and the Gramona, which just like has a little bit more texture and a little bit more weight to it. Those styles almost are like a white wine or a red wine that responds well to having a bit of air. And so I like to drink them. You know, it just saves having glasses in the cupboard. I mean, this is my kind of go-to glass for kind of almost all wines. I mean, I do have other glasses as well, but I drink a lot of different styles of wine, whether it's sherry, champagne, sparkling wines, white wine, out of this, and you've got it as well. So this style, I think, can really be quite transformative, and that's what we serve now in our restaurants. It's quite a good talking point as well. People. Sorry.
Do you encounter any resistance to it? Because people, when I take them a bottle of really nice champagne, they always get the flutes out because I think they don't feel quite right if it's not a flute. And I always say, oh no, please don't. It's a bit like playing an opera over your mobile phone instead of plugging it into a nice speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think we encounter a bit of resistance, but I mean, people kind of trust us. You know, it's just, I think, as I was saying earlier, it's interesting how these things sort of change and evolve over time. I mean, picking up on that shortages conversation you have earlier, there's sort of shortages all over the place at the moment. I mean, we sell quite a lot of Burgundy in our restaurants, and 2021 is a particularly difficult year there. And I know you've chosen a wine next that has sort of Burgundian overtones to it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I will. And it's funny because people have been talking about this problem with Burgundy for a while, and I've seen the price of some of the wines that I classically recommend every year go up, for example, from £12 to £14 a bottle. And even with inflation being what it is, that's quite a chunky rise. And it is sending people elsewhere. So for people that love that kind of taut, slightly savoury, sometimes a little bit herbal style of Chardonnay, but most noticeably with that gleam of lemony, yellow citrus, I always say acidity, I would tend to look to Australia. There are a lot of contemporary styled Chardonnays coming out of Australia that have that lovely keen edge, to New Zealand. This one that we have, you can probably see already. I'm not sure that's the right bottle.
Yeah, sorry, unfortunately that's not the right bottle. But anyway, yeah,
it's the right
estate Chardonnay. Yes, it is.
I have
Can we get the estate Chardonnay? You've got one there, brilliant.
So this is from Chile, and if you're sitting at home thinking, "Ooh, I don't think I like Chilean Chardonnay," this is probably not going to taste like many of the Chilean Chardonnays you've had before. De Martino is an incredibly progressive producer. They have quite an interesting story. It's a family-run producer. And it's nearly 20 years ago now, back in 2005, they'd got a super high score for one of their wines. They were sitting around the dinner table celebrating the fact that they'd done really well in this Chilean wine guide. And they slowly admitted, actually, we don't want to drink our own wine. It was big, it was oaky, it was jammy. And they had this kind of Damascene moment and began to change the style of their winemaking. Pretty much every wine they make now, I love. They're making wines in a much more transparent, I could say, a much lighter, gently oaked style. And this Chardonnay, I happen to have read Hamish's tasting note, and it's like the perfect tasting note. it does taste a little bit of apricot nectar, and then it washes, and a little bit of juicy peach, and then it washes through with acidity, and it comes in under £10. So if you're, I would, in fact, my mum is sitting in my kitchen drinking this with some smoked salmon right now, which I think is a really good match. So I should actually mention the other couple of wines that we have from De Martino, which are really superb. One is the Estate Cabernet, and the other is called the Legado Cabernet. So they're almost slightly different in style. The Estate is super juicy, kind of bright, lots of fruit. I like both of them. And the Legado is almost like a replacement for a claret from the Medoc. It's got that sort of the black currantiness that goes into cedar, the more savoury character. And I think, but to go back to the Chardonnay and to go back to the white wine, I think you have a white, Hamish, from another country that's really good for Chardonnay, although you don't have a Chardonnay. Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to echo what you were saying about that Chardonnay, I think that I remember the three of us, tasting through all these wines to select for the club, and that Chardonnay, and indeed many of the Di Martino wines, just really stood out. And I think it's just an absolutely brilliant wine for the price. So I've got here 2021 Old Vine Chenin Blanc from Ken Forrester from South Africa, and this is a bit of a theme running through what we're chatting about this evening. But for me, the country that is producing some of the finest value, mid to fine wine type prices is South Africa. It's just the quality that they're managing to put out at wines that sort of retail between £10 and £25 is really quite extraordinary, I think. And as you were talking about other countries, Victoria, that are doing some really great Chardonnays. I mean, Australia is a real favourite of mine, but if you compare it sort of like for like between Australia and South Africa, qualitatively, absolutely. But you could, the price wise, quite often you'll find that the South African example is 2/3 of the price of the Australian version. I think it's nice to show this. I think we did one of these events last year, and we showed what I would call one of the real kind of new wave of South African producers, a producer called Blank Bottle last year. And there is such an exciting wave of younger producers in South Africa, both exploring the more traditional areas like this, Stellenbosch, but then also looking to areas that traditionally weren't so renowned, and doing some beautifully handcrafted wines from a range of different grape varieties, both white and red. But I think it's nice that we're showing this evening both a producer who's a little bit more old school, and I think what is South Africa's signature white grape, which is Chenin Blanc. And Chenin Blanc, when South African first was produced, was generally used. It was a little bit like the Carver story, really. Actually, it was used often to put into cheaper blends in supermarket wines, and so ended up with quite a sort of negative, low-priced image. And Ken Forrester, this producer who's been around for a long time, along with a few other people like Bruvo Raats, were one of the first people to really say, actually, Chenin makes fantastic wine and can make really, really sort of high-end and brilliantly compelling wines from South Africa, which shouldn't really come as any surprise, because that grape variety does exactly that in its sort of spiritual home in the Loire Valley. So anyway, I've chosen this evening because we've had a few questions about Christmas and turkey and what we should all be matching with it. But I think these slightly richer styles of wine, which is what this is, this wine has certainly when you taste it, you can see some of the oak influence in it, but it's more kind of, again, I don't want to put anyone off who says they don't like oaky wines. It's beautifully integrated, the oak here. It's just kind of adding a bit of texture, waxy weight to the wine. And that's what those kind I think are really wines to have. Undoubtedly, I think keep hundreds of different accompaniments with it. So sort of additional roast chicken or something like that, this would be absolutely fabulous with. And it's quite sort of typical, I think, of Chenin Blanc in the sense that when you actually smell it, it's quite rich on the nose. It's a little bit savoury. There's that kind of crisp green apple. It's sort of, but then when you actually taste the wine, it sort of almost takes you a bit by surprise, because it's got this beautiful kind of sort of weight and texture and kind of oiliness to it, all cut by Chenin Blancs, really kind of a little bit like Chenin, it's high acidity. So you've got balance of and acid giving the wine this play. So although it's going to have that sort of weight and texture to work really well with food, that just beautiful acidity just sort of keeps everything fresh and cuts through the richness of Christmas. Because one thing that universally is generally at the Christmas table is this kind of sort of, it's almost an assault on the senses. It's a richness. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about it later with our red choice as well. But for me, when thinking about wines at the Christmas table, I often want things with freshness of that to all that food.
All right.
Something that is really, really showing absolutely beautifully now. I think I've also. Sorry.
Okay, just sorry. Just while we've slightly lost Hamish. Oh no, I think we might have him back.
Did you have a
Otherwise,
question?
I'll move to you.
Hello, I'm really sorry.
No, sorry.
I think
Am I
you've
back
come
again
back.
now? So I'm so
You are.
good.
Did you have a question? Did you have a question in the middle of that, Amber? I think I saw that you had a Chardonnay Chenin Blanc question.
Oh no, sorry. I was just making sure that other people could hear Hamish.
Okay.
No, so no. As you were.
Okay, so back to Christmas food. So I was about to ask, back to Christmas food. For me, it's always a big decision. Do I match the food on the table, the mood around the table, or do I just pour the Sauvignon Blanc that I know that certain members of my family are always going to want to drink? And I slightly do everything. I pour Sauvignon Blanc for the people whose favourite wine is Sauvignon Blanc. And then I quite often just look for a big, friendly wine that will tide us through. We've got quite a lot of small children in our family, so everyone's up and down and in and out, and there's not a great deal of time to appreciate things going on. But I think you might be in a different position, Hamish. What kind of wines do you like to have around a kind of turkey dinner?
Well, I mean, I think one of the big questions, Turkey, and I mean, one of the other things, I think this is a bigger thing around food and wine matching is it's kind of, are you matching wine to the turkey, which in itself is not actually a terribly difficult thing, I think, to match wine to. But when you've got bread sauce and pigs in blanket and cranberry sauce and whatever, all the other things, there's always one dish in my family that someone's sort of read online, and we're going to have Brussels sprouts a particularly peculiar way this year or something. But the kind of, when you get the sort of smorgasbord out of what Christmas lunch or dinner entails, it is actually really a whole range of flavors. So if you were taking a sort of, from a restaurant perspective, if you were just having your turkey, you could actually get out something, a really, exuberant, I think, a wine that had a lot to say, and because you've got quite a simple meat to match it against. But actually, when you take the Christmas meal as a whole, I actually think what you want is you just want a bit more sort of elegance and subtlety. You kind of want a wine to be sort of playing around in the background rather than trying to take center stage and sort of fight against all those different things. So I think we've talked about white and white varieties that go quite well at the Christmas table. I think Chardonnay, Chenin Blanc is another one, something with a little bit of oak, but not too much oak, but that lovely kind of fresh acidity. And then I think thinking about red wines. Sorry,
I was just going to say before you move on to red wines, Hamish, because we had a question from Alan about which Burgundy would you recommend with turkey. So I just wondered if you might pick up on that before you move on to reds.
Yeah, sure. I'm assuming a white Burgundy. Alan is keen on. I mean,
I was, but I don't know. Perhaps Alan could clarify.
Because I was going to go, I actually think red Burgundy is also going to be quite a good match for because I was going to talk about Pinot Noir in a second. But in terms of white, I think the key thing is not choosing something with which is too powerful. So I would tend to lean towards something like a Chablis or a Chablis type style. Or if you wanted to have something, if you're really pushing the boat out and you're having one of the sort of really top wines from Burgundy, something like a Puligny Montrachet or something like that, which is just always tends to be for me a little sort of steelier and have a bit more acidity to it. I don't want something too rich and overpowering. So just something with that real kind of core acidity, which can often be about looking at the vintage as well, and individual producers, about just choosing something with that lovely freshness to go through it. I mean, that leads us onto the red side of things as well. So I do think red Burgundy can be a great match for Turkey as well, which is Pinot Noir grape. So you can then take that to whichever country is your favourite. But again, something with an elegance and a freshness to it, and probably I don't think this is the time to be bringing out your long treasured bottle of really aged red Burgundy. I think it's something that's quite fruit forward and in quite a youthful state to just sort of stand up to all those different flavours. But another great variety from a completely different region and area that often has some synergy, but although it tastes quite different from Pinot Noir, is Nebbiolo, which is what I'm sort of well, one is a sort of, everyone always says to people like Victoria and I, what's your favourite wine region, or what's your favourite grape? And it's a very difficult question to answer, because a lot of that's down to your mood and what you're drinking and the friends and people that you're with. But the two sort of regions that I gravitate back to a lot are Burgundy, less so now because, as we talked about, prices have risen a lot, and I sadly can't afford to drink the Burgundies that I used to be able to. But another region whose wines I absolutely love is Piemonte. So and this is where this wine is from. This is a Langhe Nebbiolo. And again, just returning, this to me, although it's a completely different thing, it has a similar kind of backstory to the Cremona, in the sense that what you're kind of accessing here is a baby Barolo. So Barolo and Barbaresco are probably the two most famous regions here. Barolo probably, certainly in terms of the cost of the wines, the most famous. And so this producer, Conterno Fantino, what they do is that the grapes that are a little bit, the vineyards and some of the barrels, but essentially the vineyards that are a little bit younger, they're Barolo vineyards, they're a little bit younger, they don't think are quite ready for their top wine. They make this Langhe Nebbiolo with. So it's one of those weird wines, and it's again a little bit like the Cremona. You can certainly buy a champagne at that price and probably slightly cheaper, but I think the Cremona is a better wine and tastes better. You could buy Barolo at a cheaper price than this, but I think this is undoubtedly a much better wine, because again you're accessing really one of the top producers from the region. The reason I like this with Turkey, I mean, you can probably, I don't know if we can see my connection was bad earlier, but Nebbiolo, like Pinot Noir, often has this quite light, delicate colour to it. And it just, to me, has a beautiful play, this wine, of kind of sort of a fragrance and a perfume, slightly sort of rosemary, violets, that kind of thing. So it's again got this, a little bit like the Chardonnay, it's got this kind of almost lures you in with this lovely fragrance and perfume to it. Quite light in colour. You kind of think you're going to get something quite light, but when you taste the wine, it's a really different kind of sort of animal. It's got a little bit of tannin there, again quite high in acidity, but it's much more about the sort of mineral, savoury, leathery, kind of earthy side of it. And just for me, just a really gorgeous wine, that just one of those wines actually I could just sort of sniff for about 10 minutes before I actually end up drinking it. But again, to me, that Christmas meal, freshness and elegance, that's just gonna, you probably always end up drinking a little bit too much at Christmas, but it's just sort of, you could happily drink too much of this because it's just got that sort of elegance and freshness that you could drink for.
I think one of my favourite Christmases.
Sorry,
I talked over. I think one of my favourite Christmases was wine-wise was the one where we opened Nebbiolo, and we had cooked, sprouts with a kind of gratin, with lots of parmesan, and we had lots of chestnuts on the table. And it was quite Italian. As you were talking about that wine, I was thinking about the beautiful view from across Piemonte, across the hills from that winery. It has a stunning view as well as making beautiful wine. But if you go to Il Posto, the restaurant that is quite near there, that every wine buyer knows and will finish their trip with, it's my favourite dish on that menu is a roasted onion stuffed with more onion and creaminess, and it sort of reminds me of the bread sauce that you have on the Christmas table, and that tannin in that Nebbiolo is a beautiful contrast to that creaminess, and then the richness of the fruit, and it all goes so well, but especially if you have those Italian accents on the table. Definitely agree there.
I'm going to ask you one. I'm going to ask you a question in a second about getting back to value. You know, which other countries and regions do you think you should go to really get the sort of most bang for your buck? But just wanted to highlight for those of you that are enjoying that wine, there's in the club we've actually just looked at the new vintage list 2021, but there's a little bit of the 2019 left, which is absolutely singing now, and that's partly the vintage, which is quite an open vintage 2019. The 21, which I tasted the other day, is off the scale delicious as well, and probably classically a little bit of a better vintage, but probably needs a bit more. If you were to have it now, put it in a decanter, give it a bit more air, but is going to be a really, really brilliant wine for anyone who can kind of hang on to a few bottles for 4 or 5 years, because it'll taste like a Barolo, even though it doesn't say Barolo on the label. But anyway, Victoria, talking about value, which other sort of regions and countries are on your kind of hit list at the moment?
So this is the question that's coming up all the time. Where can I go to get more value? How can I make my wine pound work better for me, if you like? Yeah. I send a lot of people to Portugal, all across Portugal. Portugal is making some really super wines at the moment, and it reminds me a bit as a country of Italy, in that it has a lot of indigenous varieties, grape varieties that people don't necessarily know. They haven't really got to grips with. They might not know the region either. So you just have to experiment. But that's also the joy of it, because you have these wines with huge personality and character that don't taste like something that you can buy from somewhere else. I think also, Lebanon is making beautiful wines also, and Greece is, for anybody who, again, likes personality, doesn't want a wine that just tastes like it's come from just anywhere. Greece is producing some still undervalued wines. They're not super cheap wines, but they are really good value. The other trick, of course, is to go to a country whose wines are very well known, but to go to the region next door, if you like, to the famous ones. So I would say, for example, you could buy a Syrah that grows in the northern Rhone, but it's next door to, for example, the St. Joseph vineyards, rather than being in them. I think we've got one of those, or we've got a couple on the Telegraph Wine Cellar. Or we have a Spanish wine here that I've just poured into my glass. And this wine is from a region, I have to admit, I've never even visited, not yet. It's from La Mancha, which is a kind of plateau in the middle of Spain, well known for its windmills, but not hugely for its wine. And this is from Bodegas Verum, and they're a really progressive winery making really high quality wines. And I just fell in love with this wine as soon as I tasted it. The grape is Graciano, which is also grown in Rioja. You find it making sort of single varietal Rioja, but you also find it in blends with Tempranillo. And it's an incredibly sort of spicy grape. So when I poured this evening, I just thought it's got lovely texture. And it's almost sort of a little bit shaggy, a little bit hairy. You've got it's enveloping you with its texture. It's coming out, and it smells so Christmassy. It's fragrant. It's got cardamom kind of smells and mace. And again, this is not an under £10 cheap wine, but what you're getting for in the bottle is a kind of fine wine quality wine without the fine wine price. And it's just, so this is something that I would love to be drinking at Christmas, with maybe a beef casserole with chestnuts in it, something quite hearty. It's quite a warming sort of wine. I would even, it's not your style for a turkey wine for the table, but I would put it on my Christmas table with a turkey, because it's a wine that's going to come and find you. Even when you don't have much bandwidth to concentrate on it. And that's the sort of Christmas dinner that we have. It's a completely different ball game. And it just smells gorgeous. The perfume is beautiful. Where do you send people when they ask for regions that are good value?
Well, I think I echo your comments in Portugal. I think we're all, in fact, it's not just you and I. You'll find anyone in the wine trade is obsessed with Portugal. The wines are not probably distributed as far and wide as we'd all like. I think Portugal is producing some stunning value things. South Africa, as I just said, but I think that comment of wine regions that kind of almost sit next door to their sort of more famous famous cousins or partners is a good one, and that kind of leads us onto our next wine, which is the last red wine we're going to be tasting this evening, which is the 2019 Bergerac from Lollery. And so Bergerac is a region that's to the east of Bordeaux, and produces pretty similar styles in the sense of the grape varieties and the colours of the wine that it produces. So white wine, red wine, and some sweet wines as well. This wine in particular, this is 100% Merlot, but you could find wines from Bergerac that mimic either of the kind of sort of traditional blends in Bordeaux. If you're a more Medoc fan, you could find wines that were more kind of Cabernet Sauvignon based, and if you're more of a kind of Saint-Emilion or Pomerol fan, you can find wines that are sort of more Merlot and Cabernet Franc based. And you know, again, it is. I'm just checking my sheet here because this is on offer as well. But this is just under £9 when you take a case of it, and I think it's absolutely brilliant value. Again, I struggle to find Bordeaux as much as this for this price point. You know, I'm just going to butt in there
because I'm just going to butt in there, Hamish, just to say that that one is very briefly out of stock, and it's going to be the new consignments coming in on the 15th, and there's a little bit of that 2019 left, but I think you may have already tasted the next vintage.
I've tasted the next vintage as well.
Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry, you can.
Okay, no, sorry. I just wanted to because I know we want to move on to sweet wines, and we had a question before we started from Raymond about the best dessert wines to serve with Christmas pudding. So I wondered if one of you wanted to take that on.
Well,
Victoria.
I'll start. I'm not somebody who tends to serve sweet wines with pudding. For me, generally sweet wines with pudding, it's just so much. So I will only put a sweet wine with pudding when I think there's a really good reason to do so. I don't want to spoil the wine, and I don't want to spoil the pudding. But there is one wine that I do enjoy drinking with Christmas pudding, and that is Moscato d'Asti. So it's very light in alcohol, not too much sugar. It's from the northwest of Italy again. It's from Piemonte. And it's the only wine that you can find that actually smells of grapes. You get that lovely, fresh, grapey smell. It's effervescent, it's sparkling. So you have this kind of incredibly rich, claggy Christmas pudding, but then this beautiful lightness of the wine, and it kind of refreshes you in between. And we're on dessert wines, and the grape is obviously Moscato Muscat. And I think Hamish has a Muscat to show us too.
So I've chosen a Muscat, which bizarrely is actually something. When you say it smells of grapes, to me it's that kind of summer blossom as well. So actually, when you taste this wine, it immediately takes me to summer and spring, which is a rather odd thing to be showing it in the depths of winter. But the reason I've chosen this is because I think we often drink. We often eat quite a lot of chocolate at Christmas. It's another kind of sort of staple, whether it's chocolate mousse or chocolate pudding. Always a really difficult thing to match wine to. And Victoria, I know, has chosen a port for us later. Actually, bizarrely, you can find the port goes quite well with chocolate, but often actually this style of wine, I think, works really, really well with chocolate, and just echoing that freshness thing. At the end of a Christmas meal, you could drink a really heavy sweet wine, but I've just had enough by then and just want something fresh to kind of wake me up. And this Southern French Muscat, the Rivesaltes, always does that job. Just, as you say, just smells of grapes, tangerine, orange peel, hugely fragrant and refreshing. And absolutely delicious. But we can't finish talking about wines until you've talked about port, because it's Christmas, Victoria.
That's true. But I'm actually just going to quickly butt in, just because we did have a question from Francis about the dessert wines that will enhance a creme caramel. So before we move on to the port, I wondered if either of you have got an answer for that one.
Well, port. I mean, for me,
there you go.
But not port that is this colour. This is a kind of red port. So I absolutely love not just creme caramel, but all those creamy custardy desserts, bread and butter pudding, creme caramel, anything with custard or a custard tart, or anything with lots of that kind of eggs and creamy richness. I love a tawny port. So a tawny port is a port that has been aged for a long time in oak, or an aged tawny port is one that has, until it loses its red colour gently, and it turns to a beautiful burnished shade of tawny. And it acquires these delicious kind of caramel flavours, and typically has an incredibly silky, soft feel in your mouth. And it just slides so nicely with the kind of custard of a creme caramel. It tastes a little bit of caramel too, which is a kind of match. Sometimes you get little notes of orange peel, quite often a sort of lusciousness like dates, or you get some of the roasted nuts and some of the dried fruit that you find in a traditional port, but it's all encased in this sort of silkiness. What would you drink, Hamish, with creme caramel? Would you go for the same thing?
Well, now you've described that tawny experience so well. I'm going to try that because I've not actually thought of that before. I think that picking up on that kind of orange peel type character, and that I think my immediate first choice would be something more traditional like a sauterne, which has a real kind of sort of creaminess to it as well, which you get with the creme caramel, and then those kind of sort of slices of caramel, burnt caramel, kind of marmalade-y kind of character, or a really good Tokay or something like that. I think could be really, really nice. I love Tokay as well for the same flavors. Again, that incredible freshness. Lots of choices, but I need to try tawny and creme caramel now. So thank you, whoever asked that question.
You really do.
Want to tell us a little bit about the port you've got in your glass, which I know is different from a tawny?
It is. So as usual in these sessions, we have very selfishly just chosen wines that we really like, that we want to have in our glass while we're doing the talk. And not only we talked a little bit before about Piemonte. I think the Douro, where port is made, and Piemonte, where the Nebbiolo and the Barolo grow, I think those are my two favourite regions to visit because they're so, so beautiful. And you have this very strange, perhaps the first time you go there, experience of being in a place that's actually can be quite hot. I always seem to go in summer, and you sit there and you drink port and you still enjoy it, and you suddenly realise that port is not just for Christmas, but somehow we think of it only at Christmas. And for me, port is something that I sort of open the port season when the summer holidays are finished. You go from heat wave to port. I always want to give port a little bit more space. I always feels like such a shame to wait until you've had a big Christmas dinner or a big family and friends feast, and it's quite often then when everyone's heaving themselves off their chair because they've eaten and drunk so much that they say, oh, let's open the port. And I think, no, open the port first. Open the port while you're wrapping your Christmas presents up, or open the port while you're cooking on a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen. Something like that. Give it a bit more space. So this port is from Quinta do Cresto, which is actually slightly better known as a still wine producer than it is probably as a port producer. I think we have previously in these sessions, I might be wrong, but I think we've previously featured one of their red wines, which are also made from port grapes, but they are table wines to savoury still and dry wines. This port I particularly enjoyed because I remember us having a discussion about it when we tasted it. It's a really fresh port. So yes, it's rich. You do get the richness, you do get the dried fruits, and you do get the intensity. But it's so clean and almost refreshing. It's not weighing you down. And it would go, you mentioned chocolate desserts earlier, and I was thinking how beautifully this would go with a kind of chocolate tart or a Yule log. Something like that. If you're making
Black Forest,
I can never be bothered to make a Yule log, but I quite like eating them. So maybe somebody else in my family will do that this year, make that. But I also like this with the chocolate mousse. One of the things that I quite often make at Christmas is a super rich big bowl of chocolate mousse, and sometimes I put in that mousse dates with Armagnac, at which point the only thing you can drink with it is Armagnac. But if I prunes with Armagnac, not dates. If I didn't put the prunes and Armagnac in, it would be great with this port. But you don't you don't really need something to drink the port with. I think you can just have a glass. It's almost a time of day at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in that in-between patch when you're not having to do any work.
Yeah. Actually, just thinking about fortified wines, I realised that we had a question earlier from Jeffrey, which I thought we could lead on to nicely now, who asked, to what effect does the percentage of alcohol affect the taste of the wine? Victoria,
it's such a good question. It's such an interesting question, but there's really so many different parts to that question, because if you look at a wine and you look at the percentage of alcohol, and let's think not just about fortified wines here, let's think about all wines. The level of the alcohol does give you some sort of a clue as to how ripe the grapes got, because alcohol is made by the sugar in the grapes being fermented and turning into alcohol. So it gives you a clue about the sorts of flavors you might expect to find. So if the grapes have got very ripe, and you're going to get those increasingly jammy flavors in the wine simply because the grapes were riper. The tannins might be softer if it's a red wine. The flavors might be more tropical and less citrusy if it's a white wine. So you have some clues about the possible taste of the wine from that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that alcohol has a flavor. It has an impact. You feel it in your mouth. You feel it as heat. You feel it as sweetness. But the third thing is actually quite interesting, which is that alcohol does change the way we perceive the taste, or the way the flavors are carried in the wine. And I had a really interesting meeting recently with a guy called Dr. John Forrest. He's a former neuroscientist who now makes wine in New Zealand. And he has gone down the low alcohol wine route, and he's applied his very scientific mind to working out exactly how he can make a wine, in his case a New Zealand Marlborough Sauvignon, that still tastes good but is lower than average in alcohol. And he's done all sorts of interesting things. For example, discovered a leaf picking technique which made the grapes ripen but without having quite so much sugar in, so that you got the flavour ripeness without lots of sugar. So it was then possible to make a lower alcohol wine. But he said to me, but Victoria, you've got to understand that even apart from that, the alcohol will change the way the wine tastes. And he said, go home, buy a bottle of orange juice, buy a bottle of vodka, pour your orange juice into lots of glasses and add different amounts of vodka to each one. Your first glass of orange juice with no vodka in at all, no alcohol in, will be the one that has the freshest, fruitiest smell and taste. And increasingly, as you go up the scale, that orange flavour, remember, nothing has been done to this orange juice at all. It's just orange juice from the same bottle. It hasn't been fermented into anything. It's just orange juice plus vodka. It tastes increasingly marmaladey. So this is because different volatile molecules come off the wine or the spirit, depending on how much alcohol there is in there. If you're a gin drinker, you're going to know that a higher alcohol gin is going to taste more junipery and a bit less citrusy. A sort of 37.5 ABV gin will be much more, it'd be much more on the citrus flavours. If you're a whiskey drinker, you're going to have had that conversation probably 1,000 times about whether you like to put water in your whiskey or not, and what that does to the flavours when you do. So generally speaking, increasing the alcohol reduces the freshness, reduces the fruitiness, and increases the sense of spice and wood.
Very good. Right. Actually, there's another question here that is sort of kind of sort of related, because it's about serving wine, and somebody has asked about. So they said in France, they typically serve chilled red wine, including Malbec. And can you outline how to choose which reds and when they could be served when they could better be served chilled? Which actually, Hamish, is something that you've written about recently for the Wine Cellar. Can you tell us a bit about serving temperature and the wines that work better colder, particularly red wines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, if I start with the kind of with red wines, which I think is what the question specifically relates to. And I could go on about this for hours because it's one of my complete pet hates. Is red wine that's too warm. because I'm afraid I'm going to have to quote the article that I wrote. But one of the worst things that was ever written about red wine is to serve red wine at room temperature, because that was, who knows when it was first written, but I would imagine it was probably first written 100 or so years ago, when our temperature was probably more like 17, 18, 19 degrees. And actually many wine bottles are. Sorry?
Energy crisis room temperature is really good for serving wine.
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
new thermostat setting is 17, not tonight because my mum's here, so it's high, but it's 17, and that it's great.
Yeah.
The wine will taste much better.
The wine tastes much better, and often people don't believe me when I say this. And you can line up wine, and going back to the points, Victoria, you were making around alcohol. Certainly, I find that as a wine is warmer, both red and white wine, you perceive the alcohol more at a higher temperature. But really, if you don't, many red wine labels, and I haven't looked at the back of the ones that we have this evening, actually are very helpful, and they'll tell you what they think the temperature of the wine should be served at. But broadly, the kind of heavier styles, and one of I know the question reference to Malbec, and you can make Malbec styles, but generally it's a kind of fuller style of red wine. So for those kind of styles, I'm looking at sort of 18, 19 degrees, but really nothing ever over that. And many of us, particularly in the wintertime, do actually heat our houses. So, if you have red wine sitting out on the side, or God forbid it's by the fire or something, put it in the fridge for a few minutes or half an hour just to take the chill off it. But broadly speaking, as the red wines become lighter, so if you move into the Nebbiolo that we were tasting earlier, I'd probably ideally have that at sort of 16 or 17 degrees. And some of that to do with the you're at. I mean, in the wintertime, I might serve a wine a little bit warmer temperature than if I was drinking it outside in the summer, drinking it a couple of degrees cooler. As you get into the lighter grape varieties like Pinot Noir, or regions like Beaujolais or something like that, certainly you can take down to 12, 13, 14 degrees. So I think it's not necessarily about when to chill it. It's this whole spectrum in between being 19 or 20 degrees right the way down to what we would sort of, 5 or 6 degrees, which might be fridge temperature, because there's a real spectrum in between.
But people don't need to get their thermometers out. I mean, I have never ever measured the temperature of a wine. Like you, my friends routinely mock me for asking for an ice bucket for the red in a restaurant. But I remember last time I went to Argentina, the winemakers were serving their Malbec out of a fridge, and they were actually serving it even cooler at kind of probably around 12 or 13. It definitely had a kind of nip on it, and it tastes good. It changes the flavor because it kind of streamlines the wine. It makes it snappy. It makes it more refreshing. If your red wine is smelling a bit soupy and it's just not tasting that good, try chilling it, would be my advice. Well, you don't need to measure the temperature, but it just tends to improve it.
Yeah.
No,
so we've got one here that says, which wine would you recommend for roast pork with all the trimmings? I think there are so many options here. Do one of you want to take that one on? The one I was thinking of actually. Sorry?
I think we could both.
We can both answer.
No, that's what
I go white with roast pork quite often. So people think, oh, it's a meat, so you must go for a red wine. You could have a beautiful Chablis with roast pork. It's really good. You could go for a Chenin Blanc, like the one that Hamish showed, a South African Chenin Blanc. It slightly depends what you're putting with your roast pork. I quite often make that sort of slow-cooked roast pork shoulder. It's a bit like a kind of porchetta, the Italian style, with lots of fennel seeds and tons of garlic and thyme all crushed up and rolled over it and left to marinate for ages before you cook it. With that, I do go red. But I go for something like a Chianti, a Sangiovese, something that has really good acidity. So Sangiovese should not be a super heavy wine. It should be quite a lithe, light, refreshing wine. That's its very purpose, the essence of its being. And so that's also a good number with roast pork.
Yeah. And Hamish, I think, were you going to say something?
Well, Victoria's done all the things I was going to say. No, I mean, I would just echo the, I think there's two interesting points that Victoria's pulled out there. One is that kind of synergy often between the style of the dish and the region. I mean, slow cooked pork, fennel, that kind of synonymous with Tuscany and that kind of region. It's no accident that Sangiovese, with its kind of crisp stress, it goes really, really well with it. And so it's thinking about what style of cooking you're doing as well, and thinking about other regions. I mean, the other region that does pork absolutely brilliantly is Alsace in France, and again those Rieslings there. So again, with a bit of them that you can find.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure if everybody else is slightly losing Hamish, so I might move on to another question. Victoria, we didn't touch on Christmas pudding itself, I don't think, did we? We talked about various. Sorry, yeah, we did. My apologies. So I just wanted, there's a question here actually about any recommendations for wines for diabetics. Does anybody have anything that they can add on that?
I don't think I have enough medical information to know what would be good. For diabetics, is the only issue the sugar in the wine, or is the alcohol an issue as well? I
think we could do with a bit more information on that, because I'm thinking, without knowing the health sort of aspect of it, I'm thinking kind of very dry Fino, ultra brut, champagne, that sort of thing. But no, we need a bit more information, I think. Now I think we might have Hamish back. So we had a question in earlier, which is probably going to be our last actually, but we had a question in earlier about how you go about pairing wines. So do you choose the food then the wine, or vice versa? So this is like from the point of view of a complete novice, how would you select a wine? We just talked a little bit about pairing Italian flavors with an Italian wine. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of a synopsis of that, Hamish.
Yeah, sure. I think generally most of us start with the food first, because we're cooking for friends or a dinner party, so the food tends to lead the way. So most of the time, unless I have this particularly special bottle of wine that I want to think about, I'm generally thinking about the food first. We talked about regionality and country it comes from. If there is a direct synergy between the style of food you're cooking and in terms of the country, then really a good starting point is that country, the style of food you're cooking. And I think one of the biggest things, when in our restaurants we do a lot of food and wine pairing, and I'd love to be able to say, and I know Victoria's written a book about it, and I've written a book about it. I'd love to say there's a sort of magic wand that I can tell you what goes best with what. It's fascinating to taste wine and food together. Just even the thing change the flavour of it completely. So what wine goes with. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Sorry, you did just break up for a second then. Oh, I think we might have lost him again. All right. That might be a good opportunity for me to wrap up. I think that we have answered all your
I'm really sorry.
questions. There was a question. Sorry. Was that you, Hamish? No. Okay. Sorry. There was a question actually about whether we've got any South African Beaumont wines, to which the answer is no, but we do have lots of fantastic South African wines. So for anybody that wants to join Telegraph Wine Cellar, we've got him back. Sorry. Was there anything you wanted to add, Hamish? No. Okay. I've lost him again. Thank you very much to Victoria and Hamish for joining me, and thanks to all of you for watching and joining in at home. Apologies for some of the sound problems. Yeah, no, that's fine. So just so you know, this session will be available to watch back from tomorrow evening on the Telegraph Live YouTube channel. So don't forget that if you want to become a Telegraph Wine Cellar member, you can click on the link in the Q&A box below to subscribe. And if you sign up now, You can enjoy unlimited free delivery for the whole year for $35.99, and that would also give you member discounts on the wines, additional discounts when you buy 12 bottles or more, and also all Telegraph Digital Plus and print subscribers can actually access Telegraph Wine Cellar for free. And of course, you get wonderful articles and advice from Hamish, Victoria, and Susie. So I would like to thank both of you again very much for helping, for your input this evening. And to everybody at home, thank you very much for sending in your questions. And we will be sending round the show notes after the event. Thank you.